All right, thank you. So I'm Mara Shaw. I'm the Executive Director of the National Farmers Union and a staunch supporter of all of our mental health, regardless of where you live. We know this is a hugely important topic and one that gets a lot of lip service and a lot of easy answers. And we're very grateful to have Toby Malloy here today to speak to this topic. It's my pleasure to be your MC, which just means that I will be and allowing you to ask questions at the end. The National Farmers Union is a membership-based national organization for the collective voices of Canadian farmers working together to fight for agroecology and food sovereignty. Everyone else who, like me, care deeply about our food system but don't farm are invited to join the NFU as well as associate members. Regardless of whether you farm or not, your membership is important to the NFU, and we hope you'll join us. We would like to celebrate our sponsors who made this workshop possible and have supported and worked with the NFU for many years. Thank you for sharing our vision and for supporting the work. We would also like to highlight the upcoming workshops in November, culminating in our dynamic national convention, which, unlike the American election, is truly democracy in action. And I shouldn't say that because as an American, I'm very proud that democracy looks like it will prevail. We hope you'll join us for that convention as well as these workshops. We will be offering live interpretation into French for all of the workshops, so please invite your French-speaking colleagues and friends. We would like to highlight the keynote speaker, Seth Klein, speaking on A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is a great speaker and the topic is nothing less than critical. He is speaking at 3 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, November 26th. Please correct that for your time zone and join us to learn how we can mobilize to address the looming and immediate climate crisis. We would also like to offer that you can pick up any of the books by authors at any of our workshops at Turning the Tide, an independent bookstore in Saskatoon. You can link to it from the nfu.ca website, and you'll see here that there's actually an ongoing promo code for NFU participants at checkout for shipping. So please support your local bookseller. If not Turning the Tide, you can pick up the books locally. When the talk is done, you will receive an email requesting your feedback. Please take a second to fill in the feedback survey so we can continue to improve our programming. And there will also be, Kathy will be adding that link into the chat so you can do it even before you leave the workshop. I would like to acknowledge that our participants and audience are joining us from across the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. I'd encourage you to include what Indigenous lands you are joining us from in the chat. I'm zooming in from the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The NFU recognizes that Canada is a settler colonial country and that Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers share common ground as people who are on the land and who feed our communities. We recognize that land acknowledgements are only a very small start to discussions and, more importantly, actions. The NFU is committed to working both through our Indigenous Solidarity Working Group and as a whole organization to move beyond acknowledgement to action. We invite you to join us in this work in whatever way we can. Without further ado, I would love to introduce our speaker today, Toby Malloy. Toby is an NFU member and the Region 7 Women's Advisory Representative. She lives and works in Nanton, Alberta, where she and her husband, Lance, have a mixed farm. Off the farm, Toby is a master's level social worker who has been working as a counselor and resource worker in rural mental health and addictions since 2005. She currently serves her community as a counselor for the Calgary Rural Primary Care Network and has a small private practice focusing on trauma work. Toby enjoys long walks in the pasture and writing songs about life, love, and livestock. And we are very pleased that Toby came here today to talk to us about It's Not You. taking action on rural mental health. Toby?
Thank you, Maura, and thank you, everyone. I'm so grateful that you have that you've been able to and decided to make the time to join us today. I'm nervous, and because this is important, it's important to me, and because your presence is important to me, and because I'm going to be talking about things like nervousness today. I would just like to acknowledge that what that feels like for me. And what that feels like for me is I'm a little warm and my heart is elevated a little bit, and there's some tightness in my jaw. And that's also, and it's particularly helpful to know that you're here with me, because it's very regulating. And we'll come back to that later, but I just did want to put that out there. And by way of just reminding us that the things that are generative and positive also can create some nervousness in our systems. And we'll also talk some more about that. So, by way of starting, I would like to share this with you. From the poet Sally Atkins. Tell me, she said, what story are you telling? What wild song is singing itself through you? In the silence between, there is music. In the spaces between, there is story. It is the song of where you are living now. It is the story of where you are. It contains the shape of these old mountains, the green of the rhododendron leaves. It is happening right now in your breath, in the heartbeat, drumming the deeper rhythm beneath your cracking words. It matters what we did this morning and last Saturday night and last year, not because we are important, but because we are in it and it is still moving. We are all in this story together. Listen, in the silence between, there is music. In the story, in the spaces between, there is story. Pay attention. We are listening each other into being. Sally Atkins. And I would like to say that I am joining you from Nanton, Alberta, which is just south of Calgary. And Nanton is a part of Treaty 7 territory. Treaty 7 territory is the ancestral and traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, the Piikani, and the Siksika people, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge that the Calgary area is also and has been home to many Métis people and is Region 3 of the Métis Nation, and that there have been many Inuit people who have also walked these lands. So, and I would agree with Mara's opening that land acknowledgements, I feel, are important, but they are not, they are only a piece of our truth and reconciliation process, and we'll weave that into our conversation as we go along. So, by way of starting, I'd like to tell you that I have lived here for quite some time, but I actually am originally From Toronto, I grew up in a densely populated, very diverse, working class neighborhood in the East End of Toronto. And I learned so much about relationships growing up where I grew up. I've been thinking and reflecting on the fact that maybe part of that is because we were so much together, in that we were often outside together and we were in one another's homes together. And the majority of the other kids that I grew up with lived in multi-generational homes as well. So I had the privilege of being surrounded by stories, and I've always been very, very interested in all kinds of relationships. And I want you to know that, because relationships is what we're really going to be talking about today. And systems is something we're going to be talking about today. And to me, these are very much connected, because really when we're talking about systems, we're talking about relationships. And when we're talking about us in regard to systems, we're talking about relationships too. So a lot happened between Jones Avenue and Nanton, Alberta. In my mid-30s, I went back to school. I come from a working class background. I come from a long line of farm laborers and train yard laborers and housemaids. My father was a plasterer. My mom worked for an insurance company. And in my mid-30s, I went back to school because I just really wanted to work on these relationships some more. And I went to the University of Calgary, and I completed a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in social work with a clinical specialization, because I was really drawn to resource working and also being able to work in some kind of counseling therapy, because I just loved to be in story with people. And so when I came to my work, a lot of my work, the bulk of my work has happened in rural southern Alberta. I've worked in hospitals, in clinics. I've worked in outreach. I have spent a lot of time at people's kitchen tables. I have met with people in parking lots and barley fields and by rivers and streams and sometimes in bathrooms. And in rural healthcare, I think that's an important piece of what we do, because, and it's not just an aspect of rural healthcare, but I think it is and should be an aspect of healthcare anywhere, is that we're meeting people where they are, and that's often where people are. So I have really appreciated all of the varied experiences that I've had and the privilege of working with every single person I've worked with. I started to see some patterns, and this is what brings me to our conversation today, and it definitely has brought me to the kind of work that I do with people now, which is different than the kind of work I started out by doing. So I started to see patterns in the community, in all the communities where I worked, where people would come and we would talk about their best hopes, and we would also talk about their lived experiences. And there were all of these rich narratives and stories about what had happened. And we would apply this top-down processing model, which can be very handy at times. So it's not a criticism of the top-down processing, but, and I'll come back to that as well. It's just there's some things that need to be able to happen for us in order for us to do this top-down processing thing. And what I mean by that is we would be working with people in a therapeutic setting to help to identify some ways of thinking that they might want to change, or some things that they would see that they would like to change in their lives. And as a social worker, the tape that's always playing in the background for me is the fact that we come by our problems honestly, and a lot of our problems are situational. And a lot of them are deeply, deeply connected to the systems that we're living in every single day. We're all in this story together. And what really stood out for me was that people were coming and with stories of stress and what we call anxiety and what we call depression and what we call trauma. And they were telling me that this was really helpful, but that even though they knew the content of the story and we were able to explore that in daily life, they were finding that they were bumping up against situations where sometimes, even though they knew things were okay, it didn't feel that way. It didn't feel okay. They didn't feel like they could be present. They didn't feel like they could find enough safety in a situation. And that was very concerning and very confusing. And unfortunately, what I saw happening in rural settings is that people were starting to get all kinds of labels because they were coming for help and the help we were providing wasn't adequate. I didn't feel it was adequate. And the people who were really suffering from that were the people who were coming for help. Because then we're labeled with this idea of being resistant to change, unable to make differences. And my take on that was, I'm missing something really important here. I know there's more to this story. I'm missing it. I know systemically what's going on. I understand that. But I'm missing something that's really, really integral. And so with that tape playing, I found my way towards approaches like expressive arts therapy that also are dependent on working with not only the emotions and thoughts that we experience, but also the sensations that we experience. That when we have an experience, it's an embodied experience. That our cognitive processes are not so separate from our physiology. That we're not just walking around in a body that supports a brain, that it doesn't operate like that. And I was so glad to find that pathway in, and that pathway in led me to doing some somatic work under the umbrella of somatic experiencing. I will tell you that I am in the process right now of learning as much as I can about somatic experiencing by way of a specific training program, but I'm not identified as a somatic practitioner. So I just want to let you know that. And that's just a little housekeeping thing. So the learning in this has been really rich for me. And so I want to share some information pertaining to our somatic experience of stress, our somatic experience of trauma, because it's really important when we look at where we're at right now in rural health and where we want to see our emergent future go. And so in order to do that, I would like to introduce you to, in case you don't know who he is, I would like to introduce you to a gentleman named Stephen Porges. And Stephen Porges articulated something called the Polyvagal Theory. And the Polyvagal Theory is, and I'm just going to share one brief part of his definition, but then we're going to talk about what that really looks like in everyday life. Polyvagal Theory explains the relationship between our autonomic nervous system and social behavior. So, the autonomic nervous system is the neurobiological architecture of the mind-body connection. And through its sensory and motor components, it provides a physiological foundation of embodiment and the neural basis for feeling. It regulates our internal milieu, and it helps us to assess safety or threat internally in our relationships and in the environment. Now, I promise that I've just given you an explanation of something that you are very, very, very well acquainted of, because you're human, because we are mammals, because we all have this architecture of an autonomic nervous system. And I just want to say a few things about the autonomic nervous system. I want you to know that it is a restorative and healing system. I want you to know that parts of it are non-languaged. And I want you to know that its pathway is very much from the bottom up. I want you to know that while we all share this architecture, we all are having our own unique experiences, and that our autonomic nervous system is tuned and toned, starting prior to birth and moving throughout our lifespan. It's tuned and toned depending on our experiences. Dr. Porges believes and shows us through mapping that as much as we are meaning-making beings, that if we look at that pathway, what we discover is that our responses to everything that happens, everything that occurs around us, start as an embodied nervous system state. And then we create a story, and it happens very quickly. But I'd like to also tell you something about the components of this, which we know already. You know this already because we actually talk about this all the time. I have my helper here, Alegria. She's going to demonstrate, I'm going to demonstrate using her just what that pathway looks like. So here she is. Now, the polyvagal, the vagus nerve, is a pathway that runs between our brains. There's a connection that moves through our lungs, heart, diaphragm, all the way into our viscera and down through our colon. So we have a pathway, and it's called vagal, meaning from the Latin vagus, meaning wanderer, because it wanders. This is a very old system. It predates us as a species. It's 5 million years old. It goes all the way back to that time. Sorry, glitch. It goes all the way back to a time when, I just want to give you a visual on this. When our first vertebrate ancestors showed up on the scene, when there was first a spine. And we have very, very much in common with the rest of our mammalian family, more than we imagine. So Dr. Porges also, I think, would be the first person to tell you that his discoveries were not new, that this is information that ancient civilizations have had for millennia. He didn't discover this, but he did find some language for it. If we imagine a ladder from oldest to newest, the first part of the system that we developed was the dorsal vagal system, you know it as the freeze response. It's a very important part of our system. It's a survival state, it's a conservation state. It helps us go into a state of shock, and it helps us go into a place of disassociation when it's necessary for our survival. The next part of our state next part of the subsystem that we developed is called the sympathetic system, and I think of it as the alarm system or the superhero part of our autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for helping us to respond to threat and danger by enervating our system and allowing us to either flee or protect ourselves. So we talk about this all the time. Flight and fight and freeze. Familiar, you know about this. The newest part of our system is the part that's made us part of that mammalian family, and that is the ventral vagal social engagement system. Here's what it feels like. I'll give you an example of what it feels like to be in these places. I talked about this a little bit when I talked about being nervous. So here's what I feel like when I am in ventral vagal social connection. I can breathe. My heart rate is regulated. My muscles feel relaxed. There's an absence of tension, and I'm not in as much pain. And if there is pain, it feels just a little bit more manageable. I feel calm, comfortable, and connected to myself. I feel like I'm actually in my own body, and I'm able to feel connected to other people as well. I'm able to find cues of safety. I'm able to feel creative. I'm able to access my sense of humor. I'm able to speak. I'm able to concentrate and focus. I can stay in a conversation when I'm in this place of social engagement. I might feel happy here. I can play in this place. I can think outside the box. I can problem solve. We're designed to move in between nervous system states. During the course of my day, I may be required to drop down into this place of sympathetic subsystem to respond to things. And I'll give you an example of that. I come out of the post office. I'm a little distracted. I've got some mail. I can't wait to open it, or I don't want to open it, depending on what kind of mail it is. And I step off the curb, and I realize as soon as I've stepped off the curb, without even knowing it, that there's a vehicle right there. And without even thinking about it, I jump back. And as I jump back, if I was able to watch myself or notice, I would notice that now my heart is pounding a little bit and my breath is a little bit shallow and I feel tense. And I take a moment, hopefully, sometimes I don't. I take a moment and I catch my breath and things settle down a little bit and I go on my way. But here's the thing. What might happen is I may drop down into that alarm system, and maybe for a variety of reasons, I can't find enough cues of safety or comfort to come back out. My system is very wise. It's going to do whatever it needs to protect me. Here's what that's going to feel like. That's going to feel like maybe trembling, shaking. I'm going to be very warm and tense. I'm going to feel disconnected, maybe irritable, maybe edgy, maybe overwhelmed. Things are going to feel too loud and too bright. I'm going to feel afraid. I might feel attacked. I can't focus. I can't follow a conversation. I can't stay in a conversation. I'm going to be having a lot of critical thoughts about myself and probably about others. I'm going to feel judged. My thoughts are going to be racing. And I'm telling you this because these are all things that I've experienced in that state. And if I stay there long enough, if my system is under threat and I can't get out of a dangerous situation, and danger can look a lot of different ways, then eventually the wisdom of my system is going to allow me to drop down into a place of freeze and disassociation. My heart rate drops down. I feel very disconnected. Even if I'm in a room full of people, I feel numb. I feel ashamed. I might feel a sense of impending doom. That's what my mother used to call it. I might feel like I can't really grab onto any kind of brightness or happiness. And as I said before, we're designed to move in and out of these nervous system states because for us and for our ancestors, it made a lot of sense. If we're in danger, we want to be able to run as fast as we can, protect ourselves, and be able to complete that protective response so that we can go back to feeling safe and connected. If we can't get away from the threat, then our system is going to help us to go into this place of freeze so that we can wait it out, so that we can make ourselves as still as possible in order to allow time for the interruption or the predation to stop, so that we can move back up that ladder, because that's also the sequence, move back into some mobilization and get ourselves out of the way of threat, or just stay there. So, and this thing is called neuroception. And sometimes my neuroception is working 100%. There are social situations and physical situations that I'm in where my whole system tells me what I need to do next, and it is a non-language system, and I react. But there are situations where maybe my understanding of the situation and my feeling of the situation are very, very different. And so we have a lot of medicine in our system in terms of being able to manage and cope. And one of the things Dr. Porges is talking about when he talks about the autonomic nervous system being concerned with what goes on the inside, we're talking about automatic processes like my heart beats without me having to tell it to. My digestive system works without me having to tell it to. My reproductive system works without me having to tell it to. My respiration works without me having to tell it to, even though sometimes I do need to give it a little nudge. And it's important to consider this because what he's saying and what my experience has been is that we respond in a non-languaged way to what goes on around us. And a lot of what goes on around us is very, very real. And then sometimes, often, I could also be in a situation where the thing that happened that was triggering is not happening now, but I feel like it's happening. And there's some ways I might know this. Maybe somebody says something, maybe it's not even to me. And I notice that there's a shift in my system. I notice that in some conversations or in some contexts, all of a sudden, I feel like I'm 7 years old and I'm with Mrs. Downey. And she's not very nice. So we have this non-language system. And the whole point, the whole idea of somatic work is that we're able to work with the sensations of what happens to us in order to settle our system and renegotiate what's happened in our system so that we can literally catch our breath, so that we can feel like it's safe enough to be here, so that we can, when it is safe enough to be here, because it's not always safe enough to be here, and we need to be able to access those other systems. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about that, and I wanted to invite you to just think about times where you may have had some similar experiences, where you've noticed that there's been shifts, and sometimes the shift makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't. It's responsible for this. It's responsible for every single time I'm in a situation and I can't find my words and I don't know what to say. And a month or a week or a year later, I think, wow, I wish I could have said that. But my system was taking me to a place of protection for a very, very good reason. So I want you to know about that. And I want to just talk about that. And I knew this would happen. I knew that there wouldn't be enough time because it's a really rich topic. But I do want to talk about it in our system, in the context of what's going on now, and in the context of some history. Our biological imperative is to cooperate and to feel connected and safe. That's what we're here for. That's what the science of safety shows us. This is very different from a lot of the information that we have been provided with that relies on top-down processing. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the history of mind-body separation. And I don't think I need to give anyone here a history lesson. We've all sat in history classes. Well, I didn't sit in too many because mostly I was in the parking lot smoking cigarettes, but I did. I was at a few of them. I didn't care for them much, actually, because they didn't match up with the stories that my neighbors were telling me about their lived experiences. They didn't match up with the stories that I saw being lived out by my peers. And that was part of the reason that I was out in the parking lot smoking. There were some other reasons too, but at any rate, when I think about this mind-body separation, I think about how far back this goes. We could go all the way back in our recollection and in our historical records to see where political and economic systems in Europe, for example, start to find value in the idea that as human beings, we are superior, that we are outside of the family of things, that we have this amazing prefrontal cortex that allows us to make meaning and have language. And that this prefrontal cortex part of the brain is the control center for the rest of our bodies. And that's what makes us superior. And that's what makes it important for us to be able to shape the rest of the world and the rest of the living things in the world, the rest of our human family and more than human family to our form, because we know better. And we all know about this history. We brought this history with us. And I just want to bring attention to the fact that, you know, I love the language of the system and I also love words. And it's interesting for me to, it was interesting for me to find this shift in the meaning of the word settle when we use it as a verb, where it moves from this notion of coming to rest, sitting, placing, and into the 1500s, it starts to become associated with establishing a permanent residence, securing title by deed. These are the things, these are the pre-contact belief systems that we brought all over the world through colonization. That there's mind over matter, that there's a hierarchy based on thinking. And that kind of thinking was the dominion of a very small number of people. And not just the separation of us from everything else and everyone else that allowed for colonization, but that allowed for extraction, remembering that Canada was a company before it was a country. But that also, when we think about it in terms of our autonomic nervous system, and we think about the kinds of trauma that Europeans brought, because when we can't complete a protection response, there's a lot of fight in that. We brought a lot of fight with us. We brought a lot, our ancestors brought a lot of, for those of you who are listening, who, like me, are from a white settler background, we brought a lot of fight, a lot of incomplete protection responses. And that system of sympathetic fight and flight and that system of freeze, which are meant to be accessed briefly for short periods of time when we need them, are not systems of connection. I can't be connected to you when I'm in a lot of sympathetic fight and flight or in a lot of freeze. And it's interesting how this plays itself out, and in no offense whatsoever to my psychology colleagues or the field of psychology, but it's interesting to do a little digging about modern psychology and how we came up with notions of top-down processing. Because they're very, very similar ideas when we line them up with ideas of capitalism. In that, that I can change how I feel by changing the way I think. And if I change the way I feel, I'll change the way I behave. That I will change my corporeal experience of the world. But what if what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling are not lining up whatsoever? And in terms of incorporation and our corporeal experience, let's just remind ourselves of this, this handy definition. And we can see where these notions of mind-body separation, how they parlayed themselves into capitalism. An economic system based on private ownership of the means of production. The means of production, land, resources, people. These are the means of production. For profit, the means of production for profit. Growing up in a working class home with a father who started work when he was 8 years old, I was very aware that his body was the means of production. That was very much in my consciousness. And when we think about separation and colonization, and this idea of top-down processing, that in order to harm other people, in order to harm our more than human world, we have to be able to think about it as other and separate from us. We have to be able to remove its beingness. Very, very handy for capitalism, very handy for the corporation. And very interesting when we think about the fact that corporations have insisted on being afforded the rights of human beings. So we have a corporation. We have a corporation that insists on top-down processing, and a corporation that is also, in psychological terms, insisting on telling us what's fair and on telling us what's appropriate in terms of our relationship with the world. That they will tell us over and over again that we're safe because they told us so. Because they told us we were safe. And in rural communities, where in agricultural communities, this has become quite significant. And again, we could talk for a long time about the degradation of family farms and the hollowing out of small communities and the pulling of resources. And we know the architecture of that as well. I would like to say something about that, though. I would like to say, and again, speaking from my own experience of privilege, and speaking of what's happening now to more people or different people is, I think, to my knowledge, one of the things that's happening when you think about capitalism is that perhaps more white people, landowning people in rural communities, are experiencing some of the negative externalities that other people all over the world, Indigenous people, people of color, Black people, have been living with for many, many years. That for some of us, this is a relatively new experience. The fact that we're about to have open coal pit mining in the province of Alberta. For example, the fact that we have our own experience of this loss of commons when we think about our park system. And so there's a blind spot here, I think. And I also think that blind spot is rich with possibility and opportunity. And the blind spot is the richness of working with our own systems and with each other in a bottom-up processing way. And so what do I mean by that? I've been looking at some of the writing from Katrine Kofer and Otto Scharmer, and they talk about this idea of leading from the emerging future, that it's a future that requires us, this is their words, it's a future that requires us to tap into a deeper level of our humanity, of who we really are and who we want to be as a society. It is a future that we can sense, feel, and actualize by shifting the inner place from where we operate. It is a future that in those moments of disruption begins to presence itself through us. And the principles they talk about are principles of better relating to the self, better relating to others, and better relating to the system. And I think that we're in a time where we're being invited to do a different kind of listening and to do a different dive into our lived experiences in order to find this emerging future. And the idea of the emerging future that's really compelling is the idea that we can act like it's happening now in terms of how we treat ourselves, how we settle our systems, how we treat each other, and how we come together to expand that. Because as much as our system is a restorative healing system, that's the one thing I can promise you that is true. It is a healing restorative system. The reason that it wants to complete that protective response is so that I can be back in a relationship with you. That I can be back in a relationship that has me feeling most like myself and most connected and safe, because that's where we do best. And so I have a couple of minutes. I don't want to cut into our time for discussion because I think that's really, really, really important. But I would say that how we resource ourselves is, and how we look at how we care for ourselves. One of the things that's amazing about our system, and I'm looking around because I'm using this thing called orienting architecture, is how good we are at getting ourselves oriented, and how simple things like this translate to being so meaningful on the inside, that there are some very profound practices of how we talk to ourselves, how we treat our bodies. And I'm not talking about going to the spa. I'm talking about how we breathe, how we pay attention, how we treat ourselves, how we cultivate kindness, and how we cultivate gratitude, and how it brings us to a place that has the potential. There's so much medicine in here. How it has the potential to bring us to a place where we can truly be in conversation with one another, where there can be true empathy. And we talk a lot. I'm going to wrap this piece up again because I want to make room for other people. We talk a lot about rural and communities not being well resourced enough, and I think that's very true. I would say too, though, and I am the first person to tell you that, part of our problem is that over the last 20 years, we have had a hollowing out of our system. But we also have a system that I wouldn't call broken. I would say there are so many components of the system that have purposely perpetuated this idea of top-down processing and this separation of self that leaves us feeling fragmented. So what I would also say is I really believe there are a lot of our communities where our resources could be shifted in terms of how do we actually support one another? How do people like me support folks who come to see me for help? How do we do that? And that this full system work has a lot of promise. So there's that as well. Yeah, and so I feel I've missed a lot, but this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. So I'm going to stop here because it's 2:01 on my clock. And just before we go to some questions, I'm just going to invite you to do this, but you don't have to do it. Do whatever you like. It's not for me to tell you what to do, but I'm going to stand up for a moment. I'm going to take my reading glasses off, and I'm going to give myself a shake. And you could do that too, if you like. I'm just going to give myself a shake. Or how about this thing? Remember? Kids do this all the time. This is a really, really ancient autonomic way to say, I am here. I am connected. I'm right here, right now. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to take a deep breath. And I'm going to thank you again so much for being here today.